The USC Living History Project is an important legacy that the USC Emeritus Center offers the university. We are here to capture the personal histories of a wide variety of faculty and staff who have made USC what it is today. I am Jack Crossley, Professor Emeritus of Religion and Social Ethics, and I will be interviewing George Abdo, Dr. George Abdo, Vice President retired of the Huntington Library, Art Collections, and Botanical Gardens. George, this is my pleasure.
Mine as well.
You had a very rich and varied early career. You got a BA in history from UCLA and a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, a heritage that you and I share. You had served as a parish minister and participated in a variety of philanthropic and religious organizations. Please tell us a little more about your background and experience before coming to USC.
Yeah. Well, I'd grown up in Hollywood and went to UCLA. I also spent a year at the Free University of Berlin during the Cold War as an undergraduate. But I'd say the things that most shaped my readiness to come into a role here at USC had to do with the work I did when I first got out of seminary and came to work back in LA on a project working for the Norton Simon Foundation and 3 other foundations. And that led from the summer of '72 to the spring of '73 to my organizing what is now Southern California Grantmakers, the Association of Philanthropic Foundations and Corporate Contributors, with about 200 members now. It's over 40 years old, and I organized that for the Simon Foundations, and then went on to the staff of the foundation. Simon was a regent of the University of California. He was a member of the Carnegie Commission on Higher Education, and we as a foundation were involved with Pomona, Reed, Caltech, UC Santa Barbara, UCLA, and that gave me an eye in certainly into the world of higher education and philanthropy that was quite extraordinary, and also museums because of the Simon Art Collections. Among the projects he had me work on was organizing a new freestanding graduate school of psychology. A friend of his, Hedda Bolgar, created the Wright Institute of Los Angeles, and Simon gave her a large grant and me for 6 months to help her organize, incorporate, create a board, and find a building. So I had been involved in things related to higher education and also to ministry in higher education through field work I had done while a student at Princeton Seminary, worked for a year on the Penn campus at a congregation kind of enveloped by Penn, and also working in an internship in Florida, and part of that time was a resident on the Florida Presbyterian College campus.
Very interesting. So you've really been in higher education and fundraising for a long time.
And philanthropy and museums.
Yes, yes.
And with the Huntington Botanical Gardens and art collections.
All right, we know that you came to USC in 1978. What brought you here, and how, tell us about your role as assistant to the president of the Norton Simon Foundation, and how that was germane to your role as assistant director of the Office of Research and the assistant director of the Office of Research and Program Coordination here at USC.
Well, very specifically what brought me to USC was Jerry Walker hiring me.
All right.
I was out of work. Actually, I was looking to do something different. I was the interim minister of a church in Baldwin Hills, and saw an ad in the LA Times one day, and it asked for an assistant director for the Office of Research and Program Coordination to focus particularly on research support from programmatic foundations for faculty. So it's faculty research support. I looked at the ad and it said a knowledge of California foundations, a knowledge of programmatic foundations, And I would dare say at that point, because of my organizing the Foundation Association and having interviewed people staff people at 60 of the foundations in California, I probably knew more about California foundations than anybody in the state. Jerry's wife takes credit for finding my resume in the pile on the floor. And Jerry, I interviewed. Truth be known, I said no the first time around. Jerry came back at me, and I said yes. So it was what really fit me out, I think, for the role. The particular role was this experience with the Foundation Association and the foundations. And having as peers, working peers, a lot of the staff of the foundations in the LA area.
What were your impressions of USC when you first arrived?
It's an interesting question. I knew very little about USC. I remember I was a UCLA graduate. Right. I had not come here as an undergraduate. My choice had been elsewhere. I vaguely knew who Norman Topping was. I'm not sure I knew who Jack Hubbard was. I just didn't know a lot, and for that had an enormous learning curve. Like not wearing yellow shirts and blue ties or things like that, where I got hooted at once when I came onto the campus by one of my colleagues in the development staff.
That's very interesting. As a member of Executive Vice President Zorab Caprillian's office, your role rapidly changed into helping President John Hubbard with the final 2 years of a major fundraising effort. Can you give us an overview of this change and where it led in your own personal development and professional development?
Yeah. Well, this is the Toward Century II campaign of the late 1970s. And I'd say at this point, and I'm not sure it's not public information, there was a deep split in the university administration and the board, exemplified by the fact that the vice presidents of the university had not met together for over 2 years. Zorab Caprillian and Jack Hubbard were concerned to know about the quality and character of the academic programs that were being proposed through the development staff of the university, Tom Nickel and his staff. And so Jerry and I assumed a role of liaison, let's call it, to the development staff, meeting with them regularly, getting to know them, and really looking at a lot of the proposals that were going out the door on behalf of the executive vice president and the president.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So what changed then was that led to our doing legwork for Jack Hubbard on a variety of projects. He had a personal staff that had been with him, Liz King, who was very instrumental in the operations of his office. But he began to ask us to look at particular things, to look at the background of particular projects, and I found myself working on 2 or 3 occasions directly with him on things. And so there was a kind of a transition that took me into a relationship to the fundraising side of the university and to doing some legwork for the president. Interestingly, and I'm not sure Jerry ever knew this, but in the middle of all of this, Tom Nickel offered me a job to jump to the other side of the fence, if I would. Took me downtown to lunch at the old LA Athletic Club, and I declined. This was just as Jim Zumberg was about to come in the door, and I was eager to wait actually and see what was going to go on with the new president.
Well, let's pick it up with Dr. Zumberg. James H. Zumberg became USC's new president in 1980, and he appointed you as his executive assistant. What can you tell us about Jim Zumberg as a person and some of the difficult decisions he had to make in his first years?
Yeah. I could talk for hours about Jim. Mm-hmm. He was an extraordinary person. He had been a president elsewhere for many years. Going back to 1962, he created a new college in Michigan, now Grand Valley State University. He had been the chancellor at the University of Nebraska. He had been the president at SMU. So he's extraordinarily experienced as a university president. There was a public persona that was really fairly austere and formal. But personally, he was an extraordinarily dear man. We would sit and talk by the hour. We talked about very personal things. I became very, very close to him, so much so that when he died, very tragically, in 1992, diagnosed with a brain tumor 4 months after he retired, the family asked me actually to do the interment service for him in Jackson Hole, and he's buried under a big granite boulder out in the woods up there. So I became very, very close. Jim had a background not only as a university president, but as a significant scholar of glacial geology, an international leader in that field. He chaired the international body that oversaw all research in Antarctica, and during his tenure here at USC was named by Ronald Reagan as president as the chairman of the first Arctic Research Commission of the US. So in a sense, he was looking at scientific research at both poles. He was a significant figure in scholarship. And I'd say he was the scientist and explorer that he was, because he had led 2 expeditions to Antarctica in the International Geophysical Year, 57, 58, 59, I think. It affected his philosophy of management explicitly. His notion was that you always built redundancy and backup into your systems. You didn't want to be out on the ice shelf without having sufficient supplies and backup. And secondly, you always looked for the best possible people you could find and trust them explicitly with your life. And so his style of management was to pick extraordinary officers to work with him and then to trust them to carry out the business of the university.
Without micromanaging, right?
Without micromanaging. And I think the fact that he had been a president of these 3 other institutions first gave him a comfort level knowing that he couldn't do everything and didn't have to do everything. So that's one side of his character. Another side of his character was a scientist. I came out of the humanities, out of history and theology. I learned data crunching from Jim. He looked at numbers and saw things in trends. And I remember significantly, he took 20 annual reports of the university home with him one weekend and sat and personally graphed out by hand, it's before computers, graphed out by hand trend lines in the various expense and revenue components of the university over a 20-year period. And it was a dazzling lesson for me in the power of numbers and answers, because it told him a lot about what needed to be done in the university. There was a broadening gap between revenues and expense in the early 80s that had to be closed. That was one major issue. But he also had to deal with, I'd say, healing the rift that existed in the university. And it was, again, I think no secret that there was significant animosity between Zurab Kirpilian as executive VP and Tom Nickel as vice president for university relations. I know that personally because I heard it from each of them about the other.
I knew both of these people, by the way.
Yeah.
Caprillion hired me. I didn't think he was going to.
Yeah.
He didn't sound like he was going to, but he did.
Yeah. And in any event, there came a point, I actually went to work for Jim in the fall of 1980. He came in August, and in the middle of the fall, I got a call, would I please come down to the president's office, and he offered me this role as his executive assistant, and I was off at a run the next morning. Within 2 months, and I remember distinctly, it was the morning of December 2nd, he had back-to-back meetings with Zorab and Tom and let them go from their vice presidential roles in the university. And it was Jim's first step to reorganizing the university administration. And that took the form of what he called the office of the president. He created a senior VP for academic affairs and provost, senior VP for administration, and a senior VP for university advancement. And we then, in the spring of '81, set about with 3 search committees for these 3 roles, and hired Neil Pings, who had been the Dean of Graduate Studies at Caltech, John Strauss, who had been a vice president at, I think, at the University of Pennsylvania, and Mike Raddick, who had been a colleague of Jim's for many years at the University of Michigan. I staffed all 3 of those search committees and met them as they were interviewing. And Jim created this office of the president. It was him at the center, the 3 senior vice presidents, and me. And for somebody who was then 36 years old, this was an extraordinarily heady experience.
You were right at the heart of running the university.
And kept the notes and was kind of the communications links among them all, worked with them all on their staffs over the next 11 years of Jim's presidency, and then handled the transition to Steve Sample's presidency and worked for Steve for his first 3 years as president.
Well, not only that with the higher level of officers of the university, but he made you executive secretary of the board of trustees. When did that appointment take place, and what responsibilities did it add to your work portfolio?
Jim wanted to bring the functional responsibility for the operations of the Board of Trustees into his own office. During the Hubbard presidency, it had actually been outside of Jack Hubbard's office. There was a staff that was related to the university committees, and they handled all the operations of the board. But Jim wanted everything that had to do with the board close in, and so he, in the reorganization, added this responsibility to me. So that, in addition to my role as his chief of staff, privy counselor, eyes and ears on the campus, speechwriter, president's office manager, this gave me the responsibility for the operations of the Board of Trustees in all aspects. I had support staff who worked with me, but it was all of the meetings, all of the agenda setting, staffing both the executive committee and the board nominations committee, working to produce the trustee conferences for the next 14 years, creating and editing and publishing a trustee handbook. So it added significantly to my responsibility. It also made me, in essence, the on-campus staff guy for the chairman of the board. So I found myself working very closely with those chairs, Carl Hartnack, George Scharfenberger, and then Forrest Shumway, who was the transitional chairman in Steve's first 5 years.
Right. Very interesting. You know, Zumberg developed the reputation of being an excellent public speaker, and the rumor was that you wrote most of those speeches. Is that true?
I have told people that I did my job best when I was invisible. One of the shortcomings of presidential assistants around the country is that they take on airs and roles and make themselves too publicly visible on their campuses. And I had a kind of studied invisibility intentionally. I did, however, draft most of Jim's annual faculty addresses over the period of a decade, including
I heard those 10 addresses, by the way.
Yeah, including one in which he famously talked about how universities change glacially. So it was breaching into his own experience base. So I would actually solicit information from all over the campus. These were State of the Union addresses. So it was a state of the university. So I worked with the senior vice presidents and the vice presidents and the deans to catalog what had gone on the year before, and then basically drafted it into a framework that the president would then put his stamp on.
I'll take that as a somewhat yes.
It was a yes, and you know, I've thought about this quite explicitly. I think my background in ministry and in theology gave me a sense about looking at the meaning of things and what were important messages for a campus, and how did the president interpret and give meaning to both events and accomplishments.
It's very interesting. What were some of the highlights of your relationship with Dr. Zumberg and other senior administrators, such as Provost Cornelius Pings and members of the Board of Trustees at USC?
Yeah. Again, I have many memories. There were the reshaping of the university administration was one thing that happened in this period. Another was Jim working closely with Carl Hartnack to heal the rifts in the Board of Trustees that mirrored the rifts in the university administration. This is an extraordinary accomplishment in the history of the university, and an empowering change in terms of what Jim was able to accomplish during his years as president. He also took the counsel of John Strauss and John Curry, who was the vice president for budget, and Dennis Doherty, who came in as the vice president for finance, I think in '82, also from Penn, and created a system and implemented I don't want to call it a management revolution, but a significant change in the management of the university to something called revenue center management, that vested in the deans the responsibility and the accountability for generating revenues, whether through tuition or through fundraising, and empowered them to recruit faculty. It was a sea change, I think, in the management of the university. As an aside, I was in a meeting one day. We would meet regularly with the senior administration at UCLA over many years, and this had to do with the Olympics initially. But Chuck Young, who was a chancellor at UCLA, said in my hearing one day that he thought USC was the best managed university in America. High praise. High praise.
High praise. That's very good. And they implemented a variation of revenue center management.
I don't know exactly how it worked out. Eventually Chuck hired John Curry, and I think the intention was to do it. I'm not sure whether he was fully successful at UCLA.
What were some of the significant changes in USC that took place during Jim Zumberg's administration? A 2-week celebration of USC's centennial coincided with President Zumberg's formal inauguration, and I remember his enthusiasm for hosting the 1984 Olympic Village on the USC campus. Can you tell us more about these large events, and were there key academic or organizational changes in the university that you recall?
I've mentioned a couple of them here. Yes, the reorganization of the administration, the implementation of revenue center management, but also two things that bore directly on the quality of the university. One was continuing efforts that had been underway all the way through the Topping and the Hubbard years, and significantly through Zora Caprillion, to enhance the quality of the faculty of the university. And Neil took the lead on that, and it had to do with faculty recruitment. And Jim certainly sanctioned that, empowered it, and so, I mean, in terms of the upward movement of the university, this is a kind of a 40 or 50-year tidal move from Topping's hiring in '58 through the Hubbard years, the Zumberg years, the Sample years, into Max's years. And the same was true of student recruitment. Zorab had put a huge emphasis on recruiting better students. I don't know exactly when the Trustee Scholar Program was created, but the notion was there of recruiting better and better students. So we used to track carefully, year by year, the increase in the quality of students as measured by SAT scores, and we were also looking at the quality of faculty productivity through extramural support, whether through private sources and particularly through federal agencies. These were all decade-long major changes that fed directly into building a base for what Steve Sample was able to accomplish over the 90s in a genius way.
Good. Well, President Zumberg served from 1980 until March 1991, almost 11 years. 10 years was more than the average term of office for university presidents in the U.S. What can you tell us about his decision to retire from the presidency at USC?
Yeah. I think Jim had and I know this from, again, from personal conversations. He had things he wanted yet to do in terms of scholarship, spending time with his family, rewriting his textbook, had a whole host of things. And he always believed that hanging around too long was not a good thing for a president. So he was quite intentional about retirement. I think there was another change that occurred, and not everybody remembers this, but Jim was diagnosed, I want to say it was 1987, with prostate cancer, and had to take leave from the university for several months, during which time Neil Pings was the acting president. Because we had this mechanism of the office of the president with the three senior officers communicating closely and regularly, that was a pretty seamless period. But I think that probably gave Jim even more sense that he didn't want to overstay his years. He also absolutely intended to absent himself from being an active presence in university life. He had an office in what's now Zumberg Hall. Went back into the geology department and saw his professional idea for the future as being a professor of geology, I think.
How long did he remain a professor of geology after his retirement from the presidency?
The great tragedy of Jim Zumberg, and it's a tragedy in my life and those of others, including Steve Sample, who was really personally close to him. They'd worked together in Illinois years before, was that Jim was diagnosed with a brain tumor 4 months after he retired in August of '91, and he died the next April. So he was, it was a great tragedy in lots and lots of ways, and it was a matter of enormous pain for him personally to have foregone or not been able to do so much that he intended to do with his family and profession and travel.
So he had very little time as a professor free of the responsibilities of the presidency.
Right, because he deteriorated mentally significantly over the months before his death.
Well, then we have President Stephen B. Sample.
Right.
You also served as his chief of staff from 1991 to 1994. From that vantage point, you had a unique opportunity to observe the transition of authority from the inside of the president's office. How did that transition take place, and what were major decisions that Steve Sample had to make?
The transition began with a search committee of the board, and they essentially redid the same process that had eventually brought Jim Zumberg here in 1980. Remember, the presidential search in 79-80 blew up. There were 3 candidates. They came, somehow it got public, and that blew up the search. So they had to redo the search, and that brought Jim in. And that was really Carl Hartnack and Tex Thornton, who were members of the executive committee. So they essentially had the same format for a search committee in 90-91. And the board received the recommendation of the search committee and brought it into a meeting. The board met actually in the lounge of the law school that morning. I met Steve Sample outside, escorted him into the meeting. As soon as he was selected, I began to work with his staff at SUNY Buffalo. His assistants there, Kathy Sonner and another woman, I can't remember her name, to handle the transition between the two presidents and everything that went on. So I remained in the mix, and then as Steve arrived, he began to reshape the university administration over a period of months and years. He expanded the office of the president to include other vice presidents, hired some new folks. There had been a couple of transitions in the 80s in the fundraising leadership and in the financial leadership. So there were new officers who came in. There was a senior vice president role that had to do with external affairs. He hired Jane Pisano. Mm-hmm. Martha Harris took on a very significant role as a counselor to Jim and the lead person in the university's public face. A role she had had all through the 80s for Jim, she continued all through the 90s for Steve. And then the cast of characters kept changing in the officers' support staff, and I continued to work closely daily with the senior vice presidents, the deans, the leadership of the university constituencies. But it was I'd say there was a change in the character of the work as well. Jim was a very formal person, but laid back in a lot of ways. Steve was very intense, slept short hours, was up active in the morning, and was indefatigable in his energies, and was a kind of whirlwind or tornado in many, many ways. And I think a genius in interpreting the university and building its reputation, and certainly in fundraising over his tenure. I think he probably may be the greatest president the university had.
Very interesting. In 1994, you became Associate Vice President for Development, and you created and directed USC's Principal Gifts Program, focusing on gifts of $5 million or more. While you were executive assistant to two presidents, you were intimately involved in the planning and execution of two major fundraising campaigns for USC. Can you share some insights into the planning process and how it contributed to your changing role?
Right. The campaigns were put together, I'd say, bottom up. But I think part of what went on both in the 80s and the 90s was reaching out to the deans. I mean, the power had been vested in the deans for fundraising. And so soliciting bottom up priorities that needed to be included or considered in constructing a campaign. The whole notion was that it was the strategic plans and academic plans of the university that drove the fundraising, that the advancement staff was responsible for implementing and seeking support for things that had been created out of the academic planning side of the university.
That's the way it should be, right?
It's exactly the way it should be, and it was exactly what we did at the Huntington as well, I'd have to say. Being in the president's office, you can't not be involved in fundraising. Every day the president, both these presidents, were out asking for money. Every day the drafted letters to donors were coming in the door. All of them came across my desk, all of the proposals going out, all of the briefing papers for the president. So I was getting an extraordinary tutorial about lots of things, but certainly about fundraising. And Steve, as I say, was extraordinarily active in this regard. We had a conversation in 1991, shortly after he arrived, and I said, I've done this job for 11 years. I need to do something else with my life eventually. And he basically said, stick with me a while and I'll help you. And we talked about what I needed by way of experience if I wanted to fit myself out to be thought of as possible president somewhere. He said I needed two things. One was a PhD, and the other was fundraising experience. And so I set about to get my PhD, as you know, in the School of Religion. And also that led to conversations between me, him, and Alan Creditor, who was the Senior VP for Advancement, about my moving into the fundraising side of the university to get that experience. There did not exist at USC at that point an office of principal gifts. Stanford had invented this notion in its billion-dollar campaign. They had looked at the amount of money they needed to raise and the number of donors they had and realized they were not going to get from here without asking for much larger gifts. So they created this function called principal gifts, put one senior fundraiser, long-term employee of the university in charge of it, and they were wildly successful. And within short years, all of the Ivies had created principal gifts offices, and the university's fundraising consultant, Martz and Lunded, recommended that in the planning for the campaign in the 90s, that USC create such a function. So I became the person who was asked to, and I moved out of the president's office, moved into doing principal gifts. Almost invariably, those were gifts that were being solicited by Steve Sample, so I continued to work very much with him and his staff in prepping him through Creditor for all of the incredible successes that we had in that campaign, which finished at $2.8 billion. I looked one day at about, it was either 37 or 39% of all the giving in the campaign came in gifts of over $5 million. I have an utterly enormous sense of accomplishment for having been involved in, intimately involved in things like the Flora Thornton's gift to name the School of Music, Al Mann's $100 million gift, the gift from the Wrigleys for the Wrigley Institute. These are all things that were very much my responsibility, along with a lot of other people's, and certainly the president's who was asking for the gift.
And yet, along with this increased responsibility for raising big bucks, you did find time to get first an MA and then a PhD in religion and social ethics. How did you happen to, first of all, decide to do your PhD in religion? And then, as you explain that, tell us a little bit about your dissertation on the ethics of being a trustee, and what effect that had on your life here at USC.
The religion was in part because I had, from almost the week I set foot on the campus, connected with some of my ministerial colleagues who were faculty in the school. It was kind of where my natural interests were, and also in conversations and applying, it meant that some of the coursework that would be needed was fulfilled with my seminary degree from Princeton Seminary. So it in a sense, shortened the period of time that I would need to finish the degree. The choice of topic grew very much out of my work as secretary of the USC board and doing all the orientation of new trustees and thinking about what does it mean to be a trustee? What does it mean to be entrusted? What is the nature of that role? I had chaired the board of our kids' school in Pasadena. I'd been a trustee there. I'd been a longtime trustee and chairman of the board at San Francisco Theological Seminary. So I was personally a trustee, and I was responsible for the operations of a board of trustees here, an extraordinary board, a high-level board. But I wanted to know what it was other than just having meetings. And so I came to the notion that Universities generally private universities are generally invented by trustees. They always couch their mission in very moral terms. They are to educate, to serve a population. It's a very benevolent intention. It's a very beneficent means. They have to identify a set of beneficiaries they're going to serve. This is all, in a sense, a set of moral reflections, and when it comes to successive generations of trustees, somebody has to go back and look at the original intent and say, what does it mean 100 years later for USC, which started with 4 students out in the field? What does it mean when it's 1990 and you're in the middle of one of the great megalopolises of the world? And to me, reinterpreting mission is a reflection first and foremost on those moral purposes that universities serve.
Did any of the trustees read your dissertation?
I have no idea.
Okay. Well, after helping President Sample raise a record $2.8 billion for USC, you accepted a position as Vice President for Advancement at the Huntington Library, Art Collections, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino. Please tell us about your role at the Huntington and your success over the next 9 years before you retired.
I was looking for a move from USC. Alan Creditor to whom I reported was the Senior Vice President for Advancement, did not seem to be moving anywhere, and he was firmly in place, and Steve was relying on him heavily. In a sense, there was no room for upward movement. Here, into a vice presidency didn't exist. And so the logical move was up and out. I did take a run at 3 other positions with foundations and academic institutions as president. Became clear that the lack of faculty background and record of publications meant that I was probably not going to be hired unless it was way away from Los Angeles. And my wife, all these years, was the Director of Art and Senior Curator of the Norton Simon Museum, a role that we were not going to walk away from. So I started to look around LA and got a call one day from somebody I was acquainted with who had been on the staff at the Huntington to say that they were opening a search for a vice president. New president had come in there the year before, Steve Koblich, former president of Reed, and I applied for the job, and Steve picked me. The 2 Steves I've worked for, Sample and Koblich, shared one extraordinary insight, and that was that the success of their presidencies would rest on generating significant new revenues to enhance the quality of their institutions. These are 2 very different people in personality and in many, many ways, but they were both fundraising zealots and both extraordinarily successful. So I went from one really successful president to the other. In both situations, these were people who were changing the imaginations of donor prospects. I mean, we were explicit about it. We wanted to change the way people thought from thinking about $1 million gift to a gift of $5 million or more, or $25 million or $100 million, something they would never have thought about. It was an act of imagination on the part of the presidents to say, I'm going to go ask somebody for this, but it was certainly an act of imagination on the part of the donors. So Steve Koblich and I set about to increase the fundraising at the Huntington, and we were very successful, very, very successful. Had a very successful campaign, changed the way the board thought about giving, built a staff with more experience, and over the 9 years I was there, we raised $500 million, which was way, 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 way beyond
unprecedented, right?
Unprecedented at Huntington. And I have to say, I have been utterly blessed in life to have worked at 2 institutions that made such significant moves in quality and to have had the jobs I've had and participating in that, whether at USC or the Huntington.
As you look back on what really is a remarkable career, George, can you pick out one or two things that have given you the most satisfaction?
I've told people if I did nothing other than help persuade Steve Sample to go talk to Al Mann, I'd be done with life. Al Mann wants to help the blind see and the deaf hear and the lame walk, and having a role in his more than $100 million gift to USC was, I think, I look at that and I think this is something that's going to just last a long, long time for the good of lots and lots and lots of people. I feel really good about that.
And you made sure that your name isn't even on it, right?
And my name's not on it. We used to say my fingerprints are on it. I have to say, Dave Dornsife, Dave and Dana who gave the $200 million. Well, Dave and I were on the board of San Francisco Theological Seminary together. His mother was a life trustee there. Dave's a dear friend, and I was certainly in the works for 10 or 15 years with Dave in terms of the development of that relationship with USC. I feel very good about that, too.
That's good. That's a good one. Well, do you have any advice for the next generation of leaders at USC who will be carrying on this legacy of success that you and your colleagues have created?
Yeah. It would be presumptuous. If I believe what I believe about the role of trustees and staff, they need to be sensing the signs of the times when they're there and responding to them. I mean, I really think that trusteeship is contextual to its times, that they need to be reading the needs of the society, of the city, of the students, of the economy, of the world, and thinking how best the institution serves. I think that's probably doing their role in that spirit is probably the best advice I'd give.
Well, what are you going to do in retirement? You're a young 71,
Yeah.
still handsome, still vigorous. What's next?
My wife and I travel a lot. She retired out of the Norton Simon Museum. She's still involved there as a trustee of the art collections. Our daughter, we have a daughter who's now living in India, maybe moving to Singapore. We travel a lot. And I spend a lot of time kind of giving it away. I am involved with multiple institutions, many institutions. Not a week, well, hardly a day passes that I'm not in a conversation about board development, organizational strategy, fundraising, conservation organizations, art organizations, educational institutions. I'm doing a bit of paid consulting, but by and large, I think it comes out of my theological sense of stewardship. I really believe I've been blessed in life, and it's to me to use the gifts I've been given for the common good. And that's kind of how I organize my retirement.
It's wonderful. Well, George, thank you for participating in the USC Living History Project, sponsored by the USC Emeritus Center. And thank you, audience, for joining us for this living legacy by the USC Emeritus Center.